Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from here today. So thrilled to have you on the journey here for us, with us today on our session, Inclusive Communication Strategies for Global Teams. We're going to wait a couple minutes, let folks get signed on, settled in. We'll start a couple minutes past the hour. So while we wait, feel free to let us know in the chat where you happen to be dialing in from. If you have any interesting weather going on in your neck of the woods, feel free to share that. It seems like it's been a pretty active week from a weather standpoint, at least throughout the United States, and I suspect elsewhere in North America and other countries and regions as well. I'm calling in from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we did get several inches of snow last week. Yesterday, we got a lot of rain, which was unexpected and not typical for us. I think we actually set a rainfall record for February in this area. It would normally be snow, but the rain just fell on top of our existing snow. So we have a lot of natural ice rinks out there right now. Fortunately, it's about 40 degrees today, so we have some degree of melting going on. Like we have lots of locations representing here, just kind of taking a peek at the chat as we get.
I want to know if Jacqueline in Los Angeles isn't a part of Los Angeles that got hail and snow. So I saw snow in Pasadena on my friends. I guess Pasadena's technically outside of LA, but my family's down there and they've been wondering. I like to get like weirdly interactive with people, like really specific, like Portland. Sasha in Portland, you got some snow. I think I've been following all my friends' Twitters and being like, who has snow? Who has snow? Although anyone here in California may know Los Gatos, which is like near like southwest of San Francisco in the hills, they had a snow day school closure earlier this week.
Wow.
Which could have been like half an inch of snow, to be clear. But
it's true. Yeah, the standards do vary widely in terms of what qualifies.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Oakland, woohoo, East Bay. Rockland. Oh, cool. I'm like, I know the California places. Miami, I was just talking to somebody in Miami and they said it was like beautiful and sunny, and I was feeling very sad.
When things are more inequitable this time of year, right? At least in the
yeah.
little more equivalence in the summer. Everyone's more or less on the same page, but this time of year, it really highlights those regional differences.
Yeah. We've got Amsterdam, we've got Brazil.
Yeah, lots
Toronto, of Quebec. It's exciting.
The world dialing in.
Hello, Dana in Scottsdale. South Carolina. This is great. I wish that Zoom had a feature where as people put their locations in, it would like pop them up on a map.
Yeah,
that would see. Cool. That would be really fun. I'm a visual learner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that would be fun.
Good way perhaps to communicate in an inclusive fashion as well.
Yeah, right.
Visual aid that way.
Right. Some of us can't see words and know where those words are on the map. India, excellent. I love seeing the global distribution of this audience. This is fantastic.
Yeah, terrific, especially given the focus of today's session. So as we're prepared to get settled in and get the session underway, really on behalf of our team here today, just want to express our gratitude to all of you for making the time to be here and be part of this conversation. We're thrilled to have this opportunity to chat about this topic as a group collectively and with you all as well. So I have just a few short web conferencing housekeeping items that I wanted to share as we prepare to get the session underway today. So let's get those taken care of. First, to ask either Stacey or Kim or myself questions, please utilize that Q&A function that's part of the Zoom window. As part of that, you can also take a look at questions that other attendees have asked and upvote those to create sort of a curated list of topics that are particularly top of mind for the audience more collectively. So feel free to keep an eye on that and do some voting there. You can also talk directly with both the panelists as well as other attendees using the familiar Zoom chat feature, or what I assume is a familiar feature for most of us on the call. And then finally, we do have live captions enabled for the meeting today. So to enable those, all you need to do is click on More, denoted by those 3 small circles on your screens, and click Live Transcript, and you can keep up in real time with captions from today's event. So with those out of the way, those housekeeping items, did want to start out with just a couple of quick introductions so that you have a sense of who we are and the context that we are all coming to this call from before we get into the flow of our conversation. So we maybe can start with you, Stacey, if you'd like to give us a brief overview of yourself and your role and your participation in today's event.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Stacey. I am the head of employee experience at PIN, which means if you have looked at our open library, I've had a hand in writing a number of those communications. Previous to being at PIN, I was an early people team member at Culture Amp, and I was there for 5 years. And then I was at another startup even before that. So I think I have, I'm fully in this startup land as a people person and have been for some time now. And looking forward to talking about inclusive communication today.
Awesome. Thanks,
Hello.
Kim. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was like, I'm not sure if I'm
way.
supposed to just jump right in. We didn't practice this part. I'm Kim. I am the principal people partner at Oyster. This is a new role for me. It's a new role for Oyster and a new role for most companies, I think. I formerly was the head of employee experience. I've recently transitioned into an individual contributor role. If you think of like the principal engineer, like that, but for people stuff. Experimenting as I want to do with titles and job functions that maybe are a little weird. But I support our people workplace team leadership and also our executive team with some HR business partner type support. But we don't have a traditional HR business partner function at Oyster. So I'm sort of this like nebulous floating blob of employee experience and people partnership, which is very exciting for me. Yeah, exactly, Krista. Like no people to manage, just a bunch of really cool projects. But we're still figuring it out. It's only been a couple of weeks. Prior to that, I was Oyster's interim head of people. Prior to that, I was VP of people at a number of tech startups. I've been in this industry for about 15 years or so in a wide range of people focused roles. Always kind of figuring it out as we go along. Oh, and Oyster is my first globally distributed company. I was gonna say my previous experience had all been like San Francisco Bay Area tech company with like a handful of people maybe here and there around the world. But Oyster is, we're about 600 people right now in 70 countries around the world with no offices, no co-located anything. So I'm excited to have this conversation and learn.
Absolutely. Very, very cool. Thank you both for the introduction there and excited to learn from both of you over the course of today's call. My name is Thaddeus Rada-Bayne. My goal here today is really to be a facilitator for this terrific conversation between Stacey and Kim. I'm a senior people scientist at Culture Amp. One of the things I really enjoy about my role is getting to help our customers, which are very much international in scope, understand how to interpret and act on their employee data. And a lot of that does come down to fundamental challenges around communication over time zones, across potentially language barriers, cultural customs. And so I'm again very excited for the conversation today. I think it'll help inform a lot of the work that I do with our customers. And Culture Amp itself is an international organization. We were founded in Melbourne, Australia. We have a notable employee presence across both APAC, North America, and EMEA. So really looking forward to thinking about this from both an internal lens as well as that external customer-facing perspective as well. Again, thank you all for being here today. Before we get into the meat, so to speak, of the conversation, really just wanted to share with you our primary goals or overarching objectives for the conversation today. First, we want to start by addressing really why inclusive communication matters in the first place. Why is it valuable? What is really critical about this practice, and how does it help organizations? Second, we also want to be sure to devote some time to really thinking about what inclusive communication even refers to. How do we define it? How do we know it when we see it, so to speak? In what ways might we think about categorizing different types of inclusive communication? How might those different forms help to bolster or supplement one another? In what ways might they clash with one another at times? So digging into those dynamics. And then finally, we want to be realistic and recognize that there are always going to be challenges with an effort like improving or increasing inclusive communication. So we want to discuss some of the shapes and forms and common challenges that can arise and basically block or impede progress in this space. And then recognizing that, how can we ultimately make progress towards moving past those barriers? So those are our primary objectives today. We wanted this to be a very conversational and flexible presentation format, so to speak, and we're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A directly from the audience using that Q&A feature that I highlighted a moment ago. So what I'm actually going to do for the time being is stop sharing my screen so you can see all of us highlighted in a little bit more depth and clarity. And we're going to talk through a few broad questions tying into those themes that I just highlighted, and then we'll move into audience Q&A from there. So the first question that I have for both of you, Stacey and Kim, is right off the bat, I would love to explore some of the key reasons that can be used to help justify the importance of working towards inclusive communication. In other words, what benefits might we focus on to highlight its value, and what would we do to push back against or help dispel some myths around inclusive communication simply being a feel-good activity or a check-the-box type of activity. Curious about your thoughts there.
I can start. I think one of the things that has been on my mind recently is that, if we think back maybe 5, 10 plus years ago, there was this real push, I think, for the business case of DEI. What's the business case for DEI? If you have gender diverse, racially diverse executive teams, those companies are more profitable. If you have diverse, product teams, you're building more products and services that are more accessible and more representative. And I think in the past, 2-3 years or so, there are DEI people that I follow in the space and that I respect that have kind of said like, okay, enough with the business case already. And I think that makes sense, because if you think about it, it's like, what were we doing? Companies were going to their employees like, oh, we would love to treat you equitably, but what's in it for us? Could you tell us about the business case? And that's ludicrous, right? Like, to think about being an employee on the other side of that, like, okay, my company can't be bothered to treat me equitably unless there's something in it for them, like unless it makes them money, right? It's a really kind of weird perspective. So it's kind of like, okay, let's move on from that. Let's think about the fact that, it matters because it matters to employees. It matters to the people who are showing up to do the work for your company. Particularly inclusive communication matters because, especially over the past, 3, 5, 7 plus years, depending on your perspective, people are really looking to companies to react to what's happening in our society and to react to those inequities and actually do something about it and do something that's not just performative. And so the way that they, one of the ways that employees can tell, or people can tell what a company's perspective is by how they communicate with their employees, how they communicate through their marketing, things like that. So ultimately, it matters because it matters to employees. It matters to people who are buying your products and services that that as a company, you are treating your employees equitably, you're communicating inclusively. Basically, it matters because it matters to the employees. So it's really like, it's not about the business case.
I'll add that there's very tactically, if you think about inclusive communications from the other lens, not from the lens of the DEI sense of inclusion, but like taking that other lens of like just practicality wise, when you look at inclusive communication, not just looking at inclusion from a do I as a whole human feel included in a sense of belonging, but included in like, am I able to receive the communication and understand it? Whether that's language, format, style, tone, like there's this other lens of inclusive communication that's about like, are the people you're trying to communicate with actually able to understand, receive and understand the communication that you're delivering? That to me is the like, that's kind of as far into like business case for internal communication as I like to get, but it's very practical, right? Like if you have people who respond better to writing or video or things with a lot of visual aids like emojis and GIFs and photos and things like that, like it's good to know who you're trying to communicate with and what they need to be able to receive and understand it.
Yeah, I love so much of what you both shared there. And a lot of that aligns with what I am seeing quite often right now emerge as a frustration in employee engagement surveys, for example. There's often a sense and a lot of comments from employees around the communication that we receive, particularly from leadership and those at the top of the organization, is just not really giving me the sense that I matter, right? We hear a lot about metrics. We hear a lot about sort of the success of the business from a financial or profitability sort of standpoint, but to the degree that we're referenced, it's usually in the service of those things. And so I'm imagining some parallels or connections between what you're sharing there around this is important because it matters to employees. The employees don't care so much about the business component or whether it's a profitable decision to use inclusive communication strategies, but they do care from a just human well-being and individual standpoint. Do I feel valued? Am I being communicated with in a way that reaches me, that feels fair to what I see communication in other regions focusing on? A lot of Qualtrics customers have that international presence I was highlighting, and I also often see tensions where departments or regions that are somewhat isolated or have a smaller footprint feel that they don't get nearly the same amount or level of communication that some of the more prominent, so to speak, or well-populated regions receive. And so I think what you're describing there about that really being almost a basic human rights and employees as people pain point and frustration makes a great deal of sense. Any additional thoughts around other arguments that you have seen in this space around whether inclusive communication is or isn't something that should be given time or attention? Just curious if you see any other kind of common arguments either supporting a focus on inclusive communication versus pushback or other sources of resistance that you've encountered or noticed beyond what you shared already.
I mean, it's less that I've seen pushback and more that I haven't seen investment. And it's something that, like, unless you have a reason that has like an external reason to validate your investment in it, it's likely not going to be a priority. Until you see it show up in your engagement scores, or until somebody says something about it, or until you hire someone who has experience with it. For a lot of companies, it's just not on their radar yet. I think in the same way that the idea of DEIB wasn't on people's radar 20 years ago. I mean, it was on some people's radar, obviously, but it wasn't part of the mainstream conversation. And now I think inclusive communication, especially as companies are more distributed, are more global, people are more connected across lots of different cultures and work styles and norms. How you connect all of those people together under one company umbrella, I think is going to become more and more important. I sort of feel like internal comms is going to be like the hot new career, like in the way that like it was like people ops, and then it was like employee experience has been like the hot new item for the last year or two. I feel like internal communications is going to have its moment in the spotlight very soon.
Yeah, I think the pandemic really forced that in a lot of ways. I mean, I was at Qualtrics, so I was working across, Australia, the US, and our office in the UK. So I had some of that I was already dealing with previously, and that kind of global distributed nature. But obviously, but we were still in offices together in some ways. So I think that push, to go entirely remote for a lot of people, really highlighted the ways in which we were not communicating well with one another. and therefore it really pushed that focus of, it is a real baseline thing to be able to communicate well with the people you're working with in order to get done the work you need to get done. And so I think that kind of really highlighted it and highlighted the need to think about it in a number of different ways, like not even, understanding who your audience is, knowing where they are, knowing what the cultural differences there might be in communication styles, and all these different kinds of things that really kind of bubbled a lot of that up and made it a focus where maybe it wasn't previously.
Absolutely. Terrific. Thank you for sharing your perspectives there on this sort of broad question of how do we make this argument, and in what ways does making the argument in a particular way kind of send a message about why it is we're valuing inclusive communication, and to what end we're really looking at making that a focus. That makes a lot of sense. I'm really curious from your perspectives and in your experience, how each of you have typically come to kind of define or think about inclusive communication. So for example, from a more practical sense, have you found value in identifying particular so-called types of inclusive communication and working through those using different strategies or encouraging them in different ways? Or do you tend to support or find more value in a more kind of universal or all-encompassing approach?
Kim, I feel like this is one where you were talking a lot, particularly about, the experience at Oyster. I feel like
I was like, I'm gonna let Stacey start us off. No, I think there's two ways that I look at this. I look at general broad strokes, inclusive communication, like what are our guardrails as a company? What are things that we accept and tolerate and reward and encourage? And what are things that are like, that crosses the line, that is officially like not okay, not in my house behavior around communication. And that could be anything from like, harassing or abusive language to like incomplete sharing of information, but like sharing a proposal that's not filled out. Like companies defining like, this is what it means to communicate well for us at this company. But then you have to look at individual programs or individual communications. So something I've been working on with our incredible internal comms and events leader, Chris Martinez, who I don't think is on this call right now, but is freaking fantastic. He and I talk about, okay, we have this message that needs to go out. Is it going out to the whole company? Is it going out to a small segment of people? How do we need those people to receive and interact with this information? Is it synchronous? Is it asynchronous? Is it over a video, like a Loom with a written accompaniment? Is it just written? Is it something that's in Notion and shared via Slack? Is it something that also needs to be disseminated via email? If we're sharing it via Notion, what kind of format does that page need to be in so that it can be easily digested and read by the people who are reading it? Is it a long form Slack message? Is it a Slack with an embedded video? You get the point. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can get your communications across, and things like, enabling closed captioning on your Zooms, things like asking people to do alt text on images that they share. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can make the communications inclusive, and you have to look at them kind of like holistically, but on a case-by-case basis as well, like depending on the importance and the urgency and the somebody give me a good word for this, but like how important is it that every person you send it to actually reads or absorbs the information? So like the requiredness. So like we track with our all hands
comprehensiveness maybe,
yeah, like the do you need to make sure everyone has watched it factor. So like we have our all hands videos. We track participation not on an individual basis, but we can see like, okay, 350 people tuned in live, and then another 200 people watched the recording that we sent out. So we know about what percentage of the population witnessed the content. as ways to see, like, if we're finding that there are segments of our population that are consistently missing things, figuring out why and how we can make content more accessible. It's an accessibility thing. Yeah, I think it's really, there's the general standards of inclusive communication, which actually at Oyster, we've kind of gone backwards. We've done a lot of individual communication guidelines for specific things. And now moving into Q2 of this year, Chris and I are working on, okay, what are our inclusive communication standards as a company? How do we codify and define what our standards are so that we can then have accountability attached to it? And a big one for us, we learned in Q4 in our Culture Amp engagement survey, where we did our very first demographics, like diversity demographics reporting. About half of our company are not native English speakers. And just from an inclusion standpoint, it's really useful to know that half of the people you work with are translating as they speak and as they work. And what does that mean for how you need to think about inclusion in your conversations and in your expectations?
Absolutely.
I think for me, I had thought about this before coming to PIN, but I think because I had the responsibility of creating communications for PIN that were going to possibly be read by people, anywhere in the world for our customer companies. It was really important to me to be writing inclusively, to write communications that felt like they would apply to, a large group of people and not feel like people were being left out. And initially, I think I was really kind of caught up in like, how do I do this? What are the word lists, right? or something of that nature, and kind of looking around and realizing that I didn't find something that really helped me think through how I wanted to communicate what I wanted to communicate. And so that was something that myself and Dr. Breeze Harper put together at PIN, was the inclusive communication framework, which was really that thing that helped me step back and think about it from a much more broad perspective of, okay, let me truly think about who is the audience for this communication, what are their needs, but then even further think about like, what assumptions might I be making about the audience and their needs? And so really creating, this framework where we go through all of these different questions to help think about creating the communication so that it really encompasses, all of the different demographics, and so kind of starting from that place instead of starting from a kind of narrow place and then being like, oh, I didn't include caregivers, I didn't include, LGBTQIA+ folks in this. I did, and I didn't include, making sure that there were accessibility components or whatever it is. If you're starting from, the broadest perspective where you're going to cover as many needs as possible, then, that's where you really get into that, like communicating inclusively. And that's, from what you're talking about, Kim, like that is communicating inclusively for English speakers, really what it comes down to it, right? Because it is not, that is the perspective, the lens I have, and the only language that I really speak. So I think but it is hopefully something where the questions help whoever's writing the communication think through those things. And if part of the thing is what is the need of my audience, and that includes that it can't be a written communication, like then that's one of the first questions you're thinking through. Great, I'm actually going to turn this into a visual instead, or I'm going to create a video, or I'm going to get someone else to come in and sign part of it, or like whatever it is that actually is going to address the audience needs. So yeah, for me, it's really kind of changed to thinking, really in a holistic way about what I'm trying to achieve with what I'm wanting to communicate, and making sure that people's needs are met.
Terrific. Thank you both for all the insights there. And I really liked hearing from your complementary perspectives the importance of thinking about really leading with the audience, right? Thinking through ahead of time, who is this information being shared with? How critical is it? In what format will it best be delivered for that group so that it makes an impact on them, or they get the information that I'm looking to convey in a way that is effective and efficient for them. I had one quick follow-up here, and I was curious if you have any recommendations on this front. You were talking about kind of exploring almost iteratively ways to gradually increase inclusive communication, right? Recognizing that it's not an overnight switch, and it is a behavioral practice that takes some time and is almost a muscle to build in that way. Have you found value in formalizing in a policy focused way or something in that vein certain standards around inclusive communication, or because there's a lot of individual variation and it's an evolving art or practice as well, have you found policies to be kind of limiting or out of date quickly? Anything you can speak to about kind of how formal versus informal and kind of relying on norms to be instead?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with any policy is it's only as good as its practice. So like you can put it into a policy, but the more important thing is, what is the practice that you're reinforcing? How are you getting people to actually do the thing that they're supposed to be doing? And so for us, we haven't codified an inclusive communications policy yet. We've just started putting things into place that are kind of introducing new expectations. So at the beginning of every all hands meeting, we announce, here's how to turn on the closed captioning, similar to the way that you did at the beginning of this call. And it's a signal to people that we're thinking about how to make this more inclusive. And by providing the same information in multiple formats to people, by saying, here's the asynchronous version, and here's the video recording, and here's the Notion page with more information, we're showing people that we're trying to meet them where they are in a lot of different ways. By asking the question about, are you a native English speaker? It shows that it's something we're thinking about, so that we're signaling this little steps along the way, in addition to our individual conversations with managers, in addition to manager training, senior leadership training, about things like meeting scheduling inclusivity for time zone inclusivity. So if your team is spread out all around the world, and you have this regular standing team meeting that's always at a specific time, and the same people always have to watch the video recording afterwards, they're not going to be included. So maybe you rotate the meeting time, every other week, it's a different time, so that everyone gets an experience of being live and everyone gets an experience of being the one catching up. There's lots of different ways to start putting things into practice without feeling like you need to launch a policy or program as the first step.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think also because we're a bit smaller, so it really is more about the practice than what is written down, I'd say. And for us, it is, well, I am fortunate in that I get to use our own product, right? So because PIN has the ability to schedule to send messages to people in their own time zone, it makes it a lot easier for me to communicate in a way with people where I can set it to say, like, great. And I try to never send messages on Monday, but like Tuesday at 2 p.m., everyone in their time zone will get this message about something that's happening within the company. And similarly to what you're saying, Kim, for like all hands meetings, we always try to have agendas, written down first. If there are things that people are expected to, contribute or need to present on or need to think about, we're always trying to give that to people in advance. When we are distributed remote, so our meetings are over Zoom, talking about camera on, camera off, talking about what kind of practices we have. And that usually includes, we all, when we want to talk, because it can be hard to jump in on group meetings, we use the Zoom raise hand feature, right? So we know who has a question. We're able to actually make sure people are able to respond and interject in a meeting. So all of these different kinds, and that's all, I focus a lot, I think, on written communication because that's the nature of what I do, but those are all communication things, right? Like every single one of those is about trying to communicate well with one another and create those kind of practices and rituals so that people know this is how we communicate with one another here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm curious, I would love to get your take on, the unfortunate issue of challenges, barriers, blockers, things that can get in our way as we work towards making these practices more standard, more widespread, more a part of just doing business normally, part of our norms and culture. And I think we can think about these barriers in a variety of ways. And a lot of the questions we received ahead of this session highlighted some of these themes. So I suspect we can do some dabbling across some of these different topic areas. I'm thinking in terms of common barriers or blockers. We might face things like cultural or language differences, generational differences. Kim, you highlighted the challenge just inherent in global companies and time zones. Different methods and modes of communication, as you were highlighting, Stacey. Are we talking about written communication versus other formats? I'm curious, in your experiences, are there certain types of barriers that stand out as being particularly common or more widespread, more challenging to overcome in any particular way? I'd just love to hear your take on some of these categories of blockers.
I mean, the big one for me that has been a big learning curve, as I said, Oyster is my first truly global company, is the impact of cultural work norms on how people communicate at work. So there's sort of a balance between combating stereotypes and wanting to see people as the individuals that they are, and having an understanding of the cultural norms in the work environments that they come from. Because that could be not necessarily related to their location. That could just be that they've always worked at super corporate companies and now they're at a startup. It could be that, the last companies they worked for gave them a lot of baggage because they were all about that kind of Shark Tank culture. And it's the first time being in a collaborative environment. But it also could be that they come from a work culture that is, I'm trying to think of a good descriptor and my brain is just flying away from me. It could be that they come from a place that's very hierarchical is the word that I'm looking at. And very respectful of the way you speak to your superiors in an organization, or they might come from a place that's more casual and they might have a more casual tone. And you can find challenges where you get someone in senior leadership who's used to being addressed in a certain way or spoken to or spoken about in a certain way, with a more junior employee who doesn't have those expectations. And so they feel the senior person might feel disrespected and the junior person might not feel heard. And so you have to figure out where's that gap in communication happening. And those are things that can be applied to anyone in any location. It's not necessarily a cultural difference, because of the culture of the country you're in. That's just people have different expectations when they show up at work. But I found the geographic one to be really interesting because I don't like leaning on stereotypes, but I have employees from countries where they say, well, people in this country, this is just how we are at work. We are a more aggressive people at our work, or you are more casual than would be appropriate in a workplace here. And it's, like I said, everyone has their individual baggage, issues, preferences when they come into a workplace. And so it can be tough, I think, when you're looking at this to say, well, how much do I lean on those cultural stereotypes as a way to help foster conversation and understanding and open a dialogue about, hiring people from this location, that you might get a certain type of expectation from them because that's the cultural norm of the city or the country that they're from. And how do you avoid just getting into applying stereotypes with broad brushstrokes? I think it's a really tough one. And I am not providing an answer. You're welcome.
I love that you're highlighting that tension, though, because I think so many of us feel that, and that's one of the things I've always found challenging about cross-cultural research in any space is that tension you were highlighting and walking the line of what do we see as broad and fairly consistent or stable differences in how people in different regions, countries, settings like to do their work, like to communicate. like to be, you know, engaged versus not engaged when they're not actively at work, things like that, without, to your point, painting with too broad a brush or assuming that everyone coming from that particular background is going to be exactly that way and have exactly those preferences and be, you know, essentially a monolith. So I think that tension makes a lot of sense and puts me at more ease knowing that even in your space and coming from the background you do, you still feel that. Stacey, did you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, it's interesting because, so, you know, I've had similar experiences where even though, you know, at Penn, it was founded in Australia, we have folks in the US, but we actually have folks from like a bunch of different countries and backgrounds, and, you know, they might be using their first language or their second or third language. They have different, you know, expectations about how you show up at work. You know, all of these different things are also at play. And I think one of the things that I try to keep in mind, because I've lived in the US my whole life, so my perspective is very US centric, unsurprisingly. And I think, you know, a lot of times when I'm talking, especially around, you know, DEI and inclusion, workplace, things like that, I'm bringing this very US centric lens, and I can tend to do that in my communications as well. And so it's really for me thinking about like, okay, you know, the world, we might like to think it, but the world doesn't revolve around the US. So, you know, really like taking, you know, trying to take a step outside of myself and understanding, you know, that the other people, you know, are not coming with the same, you know, understanding or comprehending something in the same way that I am, because they don't come from the same context, right? And thinking also about even, you know, the way that, you know, humor or euphemisms or all of these things that do not translate in the same way across cultures, or, you know, that sometimes something you think is super funny isn't super funny to somebody else. So I think there's a lot of stuff like that, and which is interesting too, because a lot of those things are the ways people really like connect and bond with one another. And so then kind of bridging that gap as well of finding, oh, okay, well, our humor might be a little different. The way the expressions that we use might be different. So how do we find these ways to then actually feel connected to one another when maybe we're not used to communicating in the same way? So I think for me, that's something that has been, you know, has surfaced again and again over time, just reminding myself of, you know, the importance of keeping that in mind as I'm communicating with others.
You know, that reminds me, Stacey, of something one of my colleagues told me, that they're saying it's really hard for me to be funny in English. And the idea that we use humor to connect, we use humor as a way to relate to each other. And it's not even always that like my joke doesn't land because my particular breed of, I don't know, American sarcasm, whatever, like isn't translating well. It's that like my coworkers might be struggling to communicate with me because they're like, I don't know how to make this joke in English, or I don't know how to translate this humor. I love learning weird sayings from people all over, like idioms and catchphrases and things that are, I mean, I learn them from colleagues in the US all the time and places other than where I'm from. Like I love learning about these kind of cultural standards around like nuances in conversation or shorthand for things. But I had never really considered the fact that coworkers might be struggling to be funny in another language as a barrier to feeling included. And that really struck me as something to think about.
And there's one thing I feel like to just be very specific about time zones, because that was something that came up a fair amount for folks. I think, I mean, we're really lucky to have a lot of, well, I was going to assume that people have the same tools that I do. I'm not sure that you do, but even within, you know, Gmail or like Microsoft, I think they both now have abilities to schedule emails at certain times, right? So you can choose to delay a message, within Slack, and I'm sure within Teams as well. There is the thing, you can pause your notifications, you can set your office hours, you can on your calendar. Like, there are a lot of things that we're able to do with our tools that either delay sending a message or, interrupting someone's time when they don't want to be interrupted, or giving people control over when and how communications can reach them. And so I think, really, like, from the perspective of communicating across time zones, you have options in terms of, especially one-to-one communications, of setting a kind of, I don't want to say policy, but a practice of, hey, we don't send messages to people after hours. If you're going to do that because it's on your mind and you want to type it out, great, do that, and then schedule it to send, at 9 a.m. the next day, or how, whatever practice makes sense for the business. And like I said, at PIN, we can do that so that it sends to recipients in their own time zone, right? So you leveraging these kinds of tools, I think, in terms of, communicating across time zones is getting, I think, easier. I mean, it's still a challenge, right? From that perspective of sometimes you feel like you're waiting a long time. Or Kim, you mentioned this where you were saying, you put a message out and then it might be a full day before it gets back to you, and you're like, oh man, that didn't get interpreted.
When I make a mistake and then I go to sleep and then I wake up and there's all these comments and people being like hating on what I said. I was like, oh shit, that's not what I meant to say at all. But like, I just let my mistake sit there for, however long it took for me to get back online the next day. And you just have to get okay with that.
Right. So that challenge still exists, right? You can't necessarily get a tool that's going to fix that for you. But I think there are a lot of tools that we now have that have evolved to kind of meet this this phase that we find ourselves in, of really being on distributed teams and needing to communicate in ways that don't feel like someone's always getting messages when it's 2 a.m. their time, things like that. So I would say, for people who are really kind of navigating that, to really look at, what are the tools that you have that you can just use, and the practices you can start putting in place for folks to kind of address that in a somewhat easy, hopefully, way.
I would love to, if we can. I've just seen a couple of folks mention neurodiversity as a type of inclusive communication. I know that was something that I had hoped we would cover, and I want to make sure we cover at least a little bit. This is a concept that is relatively new to me as a people leader, just in the last couple of years. And personally, is relatively new to me, as in the last 2 years or so, I've started to understand a lot more about how my own brain works. And realizing that a lot of challenges that I've had with communication can be tied back to my own particular brand of neurodiversity. And I'm really curious to hear, Stacey, some of your thoughts on this. It's something that I think can be very beneficial for, depending on what type of neurodiversity you are experiencing, or you have in your own brain. I think working remotely, working geographically distributed can be very helpful. It has been for me, certainly, but not having to respond to things right away, having the internal cultural expectation that you don't have to respond right away because not everyone is even awake that you're trying to respond to, has given me some flexibility and freedom in taking some of the pressure off, and the way my anxiety manifests in quick response times, trying to solve things. I'm not going to go super deep into my own psychology right now, but the idea that we do this thing at Oyster where everyone has a working with me page that goes through a bit about how you like to work and considerations people should make when working with you. And I recently put something in my own working with me page about eye contact during meetings, because I've noticed that when I'm thinking, I'm doing it right now, when I'm thinking, or when I really need to focus, I either need to close my eyes or I need to look away from the screen, because if I'm focusing on making eye contact and talking with people, it can sometimes be hard for me to formulate the thoughts that I'm formulating. And one of my colleagues had mentioned something similar as his own description of how his autism shows up at work. And I was like, well, I haven't been diagnosed with autism. I don't know if I'm anywhere on the spectrum, but I do know that what's true for me is that just because I'm not making eye contact in a meeting doesn't mean that I'm disrespecting you or not paying attention. It might actually mean that I'm more focused. And that's probably a good thing to clarify with people and to let them know that, like, yeah, you might see me fidgeting with my little fidget cube or knitting or something during a meeting. And it's not because I'm not paying attention. It's because I need something to do with my hands or I get distracted and I can't focus. And saying those things out loud can be really powerful in terms of other people feeling safe and sharing ways that they need things that you might not even think of it as an accommodation for neurodiversity. You might just think of it as like, well, this is just a thing that I figured out about how I work. But what that is accommodations for neurodiversity.
Yeah, I think we have what we call our user manuals, which is very similar to the Working With Me. I think that you're kind of referencing in terms of it talks about how you like to communicate, you know, how you like to give and receive feedback, you know, what your working style is, all of these kinds of things. And I think, you know, this is definitely a space that I want to learn and need to learn more about. I think the ways in which I have tried so far on a broader scale, right? Because the user manual is generally a little bit more one-to-one, right? Or, you know, within a team setting, but kind of when you're talking about company-wide, this is why I really make an effort to provide materials in advance. And when I'm sending out a message to the company about like a company meeting, generally I'll include like, this is what's going to happen. This is what we need you to do before the meeting. This is what's going to happen in the meeting. This is what we're hoping the result of the meeting is, right? And making it very clear, like trying to give people that advance time so that they're not feeling that they have to think on the spot, because I'm generally not a good think on the spot person. I usually am like 20 minutes later, you know, or a day later, I have the answer for something that I wish I had maybe answered differently. Or, you know, if someone's talking, I lose focus and I need a visual, you know, things of that nature. So really trying to build in as many of those things as possible when it's, you know, broader kind of company communications. But it's definitely, you know, around neurodiversity and accessibility are things I want to inform myself more about and learn more about.
Love that focus, and thanks for spotting that, Kim, in the chat just now. The interest in and you know the pivot to some consideration of neurodiversity and how that informs this as well. I think that actually segues really well into the last kind of prepared question we had for this session, which really involves inevitable mistakes and missteps that we're all going to make in this space, right? None of us are perfect communicators, and especially when we are learning new skills or adapting our approach to be more inclusive than we have previously been in the way we communicate with others, we know we're not always going to get it right. And so I'm curious if either of you have any just general suggestions for how to deal with those moments of discomfort or anxiety or feeling like you made a mistake in a productive and healthy way that, you know, encourages you to keep learning more and keep practicing and growing that muscle as opposed to, you know, shrinking from the moment.
I think what I would say is I would just immediately shift from you're not always going to get it right to like, you will get it wrong. You're going to get it wrong. Because I think then there, you know, it doesn't feel as high stakes. It's like, you know, you're going to make mistakes, just as when you are learning anything new or when you're attempting any kind of behavior change, you will make mistakes. And so to kind of bring that, the severity of that down a little bit, because I think, you know, particularly in speaking from a US perspective, the kind of punishment phase is really like, we feel like we're getting punished a lot, but we're just learning. And so I think, you know, especially if you're learning to communicate in a different way or think in different terms than you have for the entire amount of you've been alive so far, you're going to have to unlearn some things before you relearn some things. And so really like granting yourself the space around that. And also, you know, understanding when you make a mistake, you may negatively impact someone. That it may happen, and you will not intend to do that. And it's not that people are going to think that you are malicious and you're intentionally trying to, you know, negatively impact someone. So just to kind of accept with humility, you know what, I negatively impacted someone. I'm sorry for that. Take accountability for it. You know, invite people if it's a specific person, or more generally just say, you know, if anyone's willing to kind of talk to me about that, so I could learn, great, but also without putting the pressure of the expectation that it's other people's jobs to inform you and help you learn, right? But it's really just about the idea of like giving yourself some grace, you know, have some humility, take accountability, know that you will make mistakes, and it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, I think being really expressive with your gratitude when people call you out is really important. I always feel like when someone has taken that step to say like, hey, you said this and it made me feel bad, or the way the company shared this didn't feel like it was inclusive. That's brave. That's really brave of them to say something, especially if it's something that's impacting them personally. It's easier to be brave on behalf of a group of people that is not you. If you say like, hey, that statement was, you know, maybe offensive to this group of people, I know, you know, no one else is saying anything, so I'm going to say it. It's different when to do that, although that takes a certain kind of bravery as well, right? But it's different when you're saying that hurt me personally. And so really acknowledging your gratitude for that feedback and sharing an invitation to help craft a new version. And I like to say, thank you for your candor and your courage to speak up and say something. I want to do better next time. Is it okay if I reach out to talk more about this? And then it's, you know, I think you alluded to this, Stacey, but it's like you don't want to make it the responsibility of the marginalized population to educate the oppressor, right? Like that's kind of baseline inclusivity. But when there's an opportunity to share what you are trying to do and ask if somebody wants to give feedback, or say like, I'm going to do my homework, I'm going to go do some research on this. Is it okay if I reach out? Do you want to be in partnership on this? If not, that's totally okay. It's not your responsibility. It's not your obligation. But if it's something you're interested in, know that I'm open to it.
Terrific. Those are really helpful suggestions. Thanks so much for sharing those strategies and ideas around how to be more open and receptive to both the recognition and acknowledgement of making mistakes and the inevitability of that, and also how to turn those into learning moments. I think that's a really powerful combination. I know we're close to time here, so we unfortunately can't get to all of the questions that were submitted. There was one that stood out to me and was upvoted by a number of other attendees too, which really got at this issue of how might we think about or not want to use something like ChatGPT or other AI-focused technologies, many of which we know do have a element of bias to them, to draft inclusive communications. Any kind of quick hit thoughts around using those evolving platforms in this space?
Oh, yikes. Well, the funny thing is, John did a segment about AI on his show this past week, so that's something you can check out. There is also a Netflix special, which I will try to remember and send out, that is very specifically about AI and about how it can perpetuate bias. And if I can remember that and find it, I will send it to Lexi, and so she can include that in the links that get sent out as well. But truly, like, the whole conversation about that is that, you know, AI is kind of, it learns from what's out there in the internet, which means there's a lot of garbagey stuff out there. And the fact is that they actually do not know, you know, even the people who are creating these AI, they have the code, they have the output, and they don't know what happens in the middle. And so you could very—
It's not scary at all.
Oh yes, the Netflix doc is called Coded Bias. Thank you. And yes, it is. It like when you don't know what the in-between part is, and you could be relying on a lot of people's biases because that's getting coded into what's happening as well. I would say, don't do that.
I saw somebody say the other day that I think this was in the Amplify Slack channel, Stacey, that they said that they use it as like a first draft and like something to riff on and to improve upon. Like if they're stuck on something, they use it as like an input source that they can then work with. I was like, I don't know, you can tell by my expressions, I am terrified of this stuff. I don't mess with it. And I feel like it's something that we're all going to have to become more literate in, because until or unless it like explodes and goes away forever, it's going to be here, and we have to know how to spot it, how to help train the system to do something differently, how to take it for what it is and not lose the humanity that is so important in thinking about inclusive comms.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you for your quick hit thoughts there.
I couldn't tell if you said terrific or horrific. Either terrific or horrific.
A challenging topic to end with, and you handled it beautifully. So thank you for giving us your thoughts to that impromptu question as well. I know that a few folks have already had to drop off, just because we are at time here. So really just again wanted to reiterate our gratitude for all of you being here. Thank you so much, Stacey and Kim, for being part of this conversation. I know I learned a lot, and it's going to inform the work I do both internally and with culturing customers. And thank you so much for just sharing all of your expertise and learnings in this space. That's hugely valuable.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
all. Take care.